on AM 560, The Answer.
Now, from the Signature Bank Studios, this is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson. If you're looking for the latest news, insight into what it means, and the sharpest opinion, there's only one station in Chicago where you can turn, and it's this one. We're AM 560, The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. Now, our next guest, Rafael Mangual from the Manhattan Institute, he and his compatriots have come up with model legislation to deal with violent crime in America. And I assume it's just cutting and pasting what we've done here in Illinois with the Pritzker Purge Law. Because, again, stop believing your lying eyes. Stop believing, conservative talkers with their crime porn. And start believing professional prosecutors like Kim Foxx, who has nothing but good news to report about what's happening in Cook County, for example, at the jail.
Yeah, I think judges were preparing in anticipation of the Pretrial Fairness Act going into place September 18th. And so we were seeing those numbers dip. And then I think, again, we're seeing cases where people who were not going to be detained were not being held. And so those numbers, those low-level nonviolent offenses, those people are not languishing for even a day or two. So that's why that daily population is staying low.
And she's happy to report that the daily population of Cook County Jail is at a 40-year low, under 5,000 inmates on a daily basis. That's good news. More good news. The incidence of electronic monitoring being used for those released pretrial has not increased. So people who have been charged with what she would call low-level offenses and nonviolent crimes, assaults and so forth, nonviolent, they can amble about freely until their trial date.
I'm certain they're going to continue to look at that, but that hasn't borne out in any way. The numbers have remained relatively steady, and maybe a very slight dip in the number of people on electronic monitoring. And so I think we were gearing up and anticipating that might be the offset. If you're not held in custody, then they'll put you on a bracelet. But the numbers thus far have not borne that out.
All right, so Cook County jail population is down. There's no increase in the use of electronic monitoring, the great news. Also, you're saying, well, what about the incidence of recidivism? We haven't seen any increase in 90 days with respect to recidivism either.
So far, that hasn't borne out. I mean, and keeping in mind it's only been about 5 weeks, but we have not seen an uptick in people who were released committing new crimes or people not returning to their court dates. And so I think, the fear-mongering that happened before this bill went into effect of the jails were going to be emptied and people were going to be running the streets is now borne out. What we've seen is that people who have posed a threat to public safety are now being detained, and as they should, and that people who are not a threat are allowed to go out and live their lives and come back and be held accountable without having to use our jail resources.
Exactly. Pay no attention to the people that have committed a violent crime, attempting to kill or killing someone while out on electronic monitoring, which CWB Chicago has been reporting for the last several years. Don't pay attention to that. Pay attention to what Kim Foxx is saying about how wondrous this all is, which is curious, this next statement from Harold Ford, the former Dem legislator from Tennessee, who you now can see on the 5 if you can tolerate that program, which I can't.
That show.
Harold Ford talking about New York and the incidence of violent crime in New York, which is much lower on a per capita basis than Chicago. And New York, they moved to a no cash bail, not as comprehensively as Illinois did, to their shame. But they moved to a modified no cash bail back in 2019. So they have 4 years of experience with this. And Harold Ford had this to say about reducing violent crime in metropolitan areas like New York.
First, you got to end cashless bail. It's not working. I was one from the outset that thought that there might be some benefit, but it has not turned out to be a benefit. Right. And I think you have to be responsible and say it's not working.
How it's not working in New York? I can only assume it's not working in New York because they didn't go as far as we did in Illinois. They need to go further with no cash bail. So, again, let's cut and paste the Safety Act, the Pritzker Purge Law, and let's use Illinois as the model for good governments, as it is in so many other instances. Right? Rafael Mangual is a senior fellow and the head of research for the Manhattan Institute's Policing and Public Safety Initiative. He's also the author of the book Criminal Injustice: What the Push for Mass Decarceration and Depolicing Gets Wrong and Who It Hurts Most. Rafael, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me back.
Who are you more surprised by in terms of their comments, Kim Foxx or Harold Ford?
Probably Ford, only because the sky hasn't quite fallen yet in New York. And so, that has definitely emboldened the defenders of our crazy bail laws and our other criminal justice reforms. Kim Foxx is just operating in a different world, right? She's completely detached from reality and is 100% unwilling to engage with data and with the reality on the ground. I mean, there are just cases after cases and examples after examples of people who have committed heinous offenses, low-level offenses, who have been caught repeatedly with illegal firearms, all while having an active criminal justice status, whether that means they're out on pretrial release or on probation or parole. The idea that the criminal justice system in the state of Illinois or in the city of Chicago is doing a good job of incapacitating the most violent people, I think is laughable.
And New York, we know because they have more than a month, a little over a month worth of data. They have 4 years of it. The most recent research I saw was, and I think it was a colleague of yours at the Manhattan Institute, saw a statistically significant increase in crime, violent crime, Class X felonies, since their modified no-cash bail system was enacted in 2019, right?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that defenders of these things like to say is that, post-reform, we see people who are out on pretrial release reoffending at the same rate. This is what they hang their hat on. But here's the thing. If you have more people out on pretrial release and that population offends at the same rate, well, that means an increase in crime, right? If you have 100 people, 10% of whom will reoffend, and then you increase the number of pretrial releasees to 200 people, well, now you've just doubled the number of offenses.
Oh, whoa! We don't do math in Cook County. Please, I thought we made that clear. All right, well, let's get to your proposed model legislation in terms of what communities like Cook County, states like Illinois could do if they were not criminally insane.
Yeah, so, what I really wanted to do with this new report was just kind of figure out, how can people who are on the right side of this issue play a little bit of offense, right? We spend most of our time, I know certainly at the Manhattan Institute and lots of other people who are working in this space kind of batting down bad ideas, and that can certainly be a full employment program if you want it to be. But I really wanted to come up with a plan of offense, right? So, there are kind of three things that I think are probably the biggest holes in our criminal justice system, and the vast majority of them have to do with reoffenses, recidivism, repeat offending by people who have very extensive criminal histories, right? If you look at the city of Chicago, for example, the University of Chicago Crime Lab released a report on shootings and homicides in 2015 and 16 and found that on average, people charged with those offenses had 12 prior arrests. Almost 1 in 5 had more than 20 prior arrests, right? So what this tells us is that there's a problem. This criminal justice system is not doing a very good job of keeping the people who need to be off the street. Why? Well, because you have prosecutors like Kim Foxx who aren't pursuing charges to the full extent of the law. You have judges like Tim Evans who are just not going to be trustworthy when it comes time to actually put somebody behind bars for a significant period of time. You have parole boards that are just out of control and grant parole as a rubber stamp, and that puts a lot of reoffenders on the street. So one thing that you can do is you can draw a line in the sand as to repeated criminal offending and say beyond this point, no more. What does that look like? The kind of original version of this was the 3 strikes laws that we saw popping up around the country starting in the 1970s and 80s. There were some critiques of those regimes. I like to think that this kind of modified 3 strikes proposal is responsive to those critiques in the sense that it widens the scope of offenses that can get you a point towards a strike, whereas many 3 strikes regimes, you could only get a strike for a serious violent felony. This will get you a partial strike even for certain misdemeanor convictions, but it also rewards desistance. So if you go a period of years, starting at 3 years, then 5 years, and 10 years without reoffending, you will get strikes taken off your record, right? So it creates incentives in both directions. But what we know is that, people who are reoffending can be deterred by the prospect of serious amounts of time. The other thing, though, is that, a lot of times our criminal justice systems give way too much good time credit for people who are actually sent to prison, even if they're sent to prison for a relatively long time, such that they're cutting their sentences more than half. So the other thing that we wanted to do was propose a kind of modified truth in sentencing regime that will raise the threshold of the share of a sentence that someone has to serve before they're eligible for release, irrespective of the kinds of good time credits that that they might otherwise acquire. And then people say, well, you're kind of disincentivizing then individuals who are incarcerated from participating in programs because they may no longer get the benefit. And what I say to that is, show me the evidence that these programs are actually reducing recidivism in some significant way. I mean, from where I can sit, the recidivism data in this country shows that somewhere between 80 and 83% of people who are released from state prisons are going to reoffend at least once. Right, that's a major problem. So we need to maximize incapacitation. That's the main goal of these proposals. But the third proposal is really, really key in that it has nothing to do with sentencing or punishment, but has everything to do with data transparency. What we want is for people in prosecutors' offices like the Cook County State's Attorney's Office with prosecutors like Kim Fox and people like George Gascon out in L.A. and Larry Krasner in Philadelphia, is to have to start reporting in a uniform way the measures that we all know indicate their failures. For example, what share of homicides or other serious felonies are committed by people with an active criminal justice status? What share are committed by people on parole, on probation, out on pretrial release? What's the average number of prior arrests for people who were charged with serious offenses, et cetera? Making jurisdictions report that data in a systematic way on a regular basis will allow us to track the success or failures of their policies, and will also allow the institutions that have been the object of really terrible and bad faith critiques defend themselves against those critiques by being able to point to the hard numbers of why they're doing what they're doing.
Is any district doing that so far, anywhere in the country?
So we have seen a few states recently start to toy with these ideas. So Tennessee has been just an absolute leader on this stuff. They actually passed a truth in sentencing regime and signed it into law just last year, or last session, I should say. And they have already proposed a modified three strikes bill. So I'll be interested to see, how that ends up playing out. And yeah, I do think, in Congress, for example, Nicole Maliotakis, Republican representative from New York, has proposed a very similar data transparency measure. So there's definitely momentum starting to build up for this. And what I'd like to do is sort of have this blueprint for people who care about these issues to start putting that concern into action.
And the point here that you make often, but it bears emphasis, is we're trying to zero in on the serial predators. We're not trying to grow the population in Cook County Jail or anywhere else, or the number of people on electronic monitoring just for the purposes of sidelining more people who've committed a particular offense. We're really trying to get to this subgroup that's responsible for the preponderance, if not the majority, of the violent crime.
That's exactly right. I mean, if you look at any jurisdiction around the world, what you're going to see consistently is that the vast majority of serious offenses are committed by a very, very small slice of the population that's constituted by very active serial offenders. The critique against kind of tough on crime policies is always that, well, you're just pursuing mass incarceration. You just want to throw everyone away and lock away the key. And of course, that's not the case. When you look at, these proposals, for example, you'll see that they really only attach to people who are repeat offenders and who are committing very, very serious violent crimes that have very, very high social costs. Right. So, if you look at the kind of offense profile or criminal history profile that someone who might be eligible for a third strike under this sort of regime would be, I have to ask, critics of this, you tell me why the guy with 4, misdemeanor convictions and 3 nonviolent felony convictions and 2 violent felony convictions doesn't need to go away for a long time. I mean, you
Rafael-
tell me why we should roll the dice.
Rafael Mangual is a senior fellow and the head of research for the Manhattan Institute's Policing and Public Safety Initiative. He's the author of the book Criminal Injustice: What the Push for Mass Decarceration and Depolicing Gets Wrong and Who It Hurts Most. Rafael, thank you as always.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
The stories you need to know to start your day. This is Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
The following is a paid political announcement.
Valparaiso is a growing community that has become a model city for the Midwest. Valparaiso has momentum, and Matt Murphy wants to make sure we keep moving forward.
Over the past 4 years, we have prioritized public safety by adding additional police officers, firefighters, and school resource officers, and decreased crime by 11%.